Join us as we take a deep dive into the critically acclaimed film, Good Will Hunting. Explore the profound story of a brilliant but troubled young man in this captivating movie recap. The story takes place at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. A professor named Gerald Lambeau is teaching a math class. After the lecture, he tells his graduate students that he will write a very difficult math problem on the board. The student who solves it will have their name displayed on the MIT Tech board. The question is so challenging that he gives them until the end of the semester to solve it. The lecture ends and we see Will Hunting, a janitor at MIT, looking at the math problem written by Professor Gerald. Later, Will goes home and attempts to solve the equation on his bathroom mirror. The next day, when he's alone in the hallway, he writes the answer to the problem with a chalk. Apart from work, Will spends his time drinking and hanging out with his friends Chucky, Billy, and Morgan. One day, while watching a kid's baseball game, Will recognizes a person who used to bully him in school. Later, he and his friends confront the bully and start a fight. In the end, Will defeats the bully mercilessly. His friends intervene and stop him, but when the police try to restrain him, he attacks an officer and gets arrested. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald is informed by his students that the math problem has been solved. He rushes to check and sees that someone has indeed solved his question. He asks his students if any of them are the ones who solved it, but none of them confirm it, leaving him confused. The news spreads, and the next class is packed with students curious to know who the mysterious math genius is. Professor Gerald calls for the person to come forward and claim their prize, but everyone in the class remains silent, waiting for someone to step up. Since no one claims to have solved the problem, Professor Gerald announces that he has created another math problem that took him 2 years to solve. On the other hand, Will is released from jail and immediately starts working on solving the new problem. At the same time, Professor Gerald exits his office and sees Will writing on the board. Assuming Will is just vandalizing the board, he approaches him. Will quickly escapes when he sees Professor Gerald coming towards him. Later, when Professor Gerald returns and sees that Will has actually solved the problem that took him 2 years, he realizes who the mysterious math genius is. After work, Will meets his friends and they go to a bar for drinks. Chucky approaches a couple of attractive ladies and starts flirting. To impress them, Chucky lies that he attends the same class as them. Suddenly, a man interrupts and questions which class Chucky is referring to. Chucky replies, "History." The man happens to be in the same class as the girls and knows Chucky is lying. He tries to embarrass Chucky by asking for his opinions on historical matters. Not being a history student, Chucky remains silent. Will steps in for his friend and engages in a debate with the man, presenting facts and his own thoughts. The man counters, but Will interrupts him and finishes his entire sentence, exposing him for reciting a passage, word by word, from a book. Feeling embarrassed, the man walks away. Later, one of the girls named Skylar approaches Will and gives him her phone number. Impressed by Will's display of intelligence, Skylar asks him to call her so they can go out for drinks in the future. Will proudly shows the phone number to the man who was trying to appear smart. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald has been searching for the janitor who solved his complex math problems. After inquiring with several people, he finally obtains contact information for Will. He attends Will's court hearing for assaulting a police officer. Will defends himself, but the judge informs him that he has a history of previous cases involving minor theft and assaults. The judge declares that he cannot ignore all of Will's actions and sentences him to jail with a bail of $50,000. Consequently, Will is sent to prison, where he encounters Professor Gerald, who proposes an offer. Professor Gerald informs Will that he has spoken with the judge and is willing to grant him a pardon. But there are 2 conditions. Firstly, Will must attend mathematics classes with Professor Gerald, and secondly, he must receive counseling. Soon, Will begins his mathematics classes with Professor Gerald, who is impressed by his intelligence and feels proud of his abilities. Next, he must attend counseling sessions with a therapist. However, regardless of how many therapists he visits, Will refuses to open up and instead ridicules them. He mocks their books and makes a mockery of the counseling process. As a last resort, Professor Gerald reaches out to his old friend Sean McGuire for assistance. Sean, who now teaches psychology at a community college, initially declines due to lack of time. However, Professor Gerald insists that Sean's help is crucial. highlighting Will's genius and the potential for counseling to positively impact his life. Eventually, Sean agrees and meets with Will. During their first therapy session, Sean requests Professor Gerald and his assistant to leave the room. Similar to his previous encounters, Will begins to mock Sean's book collection. However, Sean recognizes this as Will's defense mechanism and remains composed, engaging in regular conversation without prying into Will's personal life. Will then notices a painting created by Sean himself and makes false assumptions about Sean's life based on it. Sean once again refrains from reacting to Will's insults, but when Will mentions Sean's wife, Sean becomes slightly irritated. Realizing that Sean's vulnerable point is his wife, Will continues to bring her up and even questions if she cheated on him. At that moment, Will declares the session over, and Sean releases his grip. Will exits the session believing he has once again managed to undermine a therapist. Observing Sean's mood, Professor Gerald assumes he won't continue the sessions with Will. Surprisingly, Sean requests to carry on with their sessions starting from the following week. After his counseling, Will goes on a date with Skylar. During their time together, Will discovers that Skylar comes from a wealthy family and studies at Harvard. They connect instantly and enjoy each other's company. When Will returns to Sean's office for their next session, Sean asks him to step outside. They head to a park, where Sean engages in a heartfelt conversation with Will. Sean admits that he pondered over Will's remarks about his painting and eventually realized that Will is just a young individual who lacks understanding. Sean acknowledges that reading a few art books doesn't enable him to assume things about someone's life. Will returns to his routine with his friend Chucky picking him up and taking him to their workplace at a construction site. He hesitates to call Skylar, fearing the conversation. During his third therapy session with Sean, both Will and Sean remain silent throughout the entire hour. The fourth session follows a similar pattern with no words spoken. However, out of boredom, Will tells a joke to Sean. Seizing the opportunity, Sean inquires if Will has a girlfriend. Will proceeds to share about Skylar and how he hasn't been in contact with her since their first date. When Sean asks why, Will expresses his belief that Skylar is too good for him, and continuing to talk to her would ruin everything. In response, Sean tells him that no one is ever too good or perfect. Everyone has flaws, but what truly matters is whether that person is perfect for you or not. To emphasize his point, Sean shares the personal anecdote about his wife, revealing that she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen and the one he fell in love with. This suddenly transforms the entire mood in the room. Will and Sean burst into laughter that they can't control. As a result, they become closer to each other, and Will begins to feel at ease in Sean's presence. The session concludes with Sean advising Will not to believe that Skylar is too superior for him. Will is so engrossed in Sean's words that he needs to be reminded that their session has come to an end. Encouraged by Sean's kind words, Will feels inspired and decides to visit Skylar at her dormitory to ask her out once again. Skylar expresses her interest in going out with him, but mentions that she's currently occupied with a complex problem that might take a while to solve. Will, unable to wait any longer, quickly finds a solution and writes it down on a napkin, handing it to her. With the problem sorted, Skylar and Will embark on their second date. During their time together, Skylar inquires about Will's family. To impress her, Will fibs and claims to have a dozen siblings. When Skylar requests their names, Will blurts out 12 names in a random sequence. In his therapy session with Sean, Will poses a question about regret. He wonders if Sean ever regretted meeting his wife, considering the pain he endured following her passing. In response, Sean recounts the story of how he met his wife. He recounts spotting her while waiting in line with his friends to purchase tickets for a famous baseball game. Will, filled with excitement, assumes Sean witnessed the game live, but Sean reveals that he actually abandoned his friends to go on a date with the girl who would eventually become his wife. He ended up watching the game on TV instead. Returning to Will's initial question, Sean assures him that he has no regrets about missing the game. Meeting his wife and having her in his life, even for a limited time, was invaluable to him. Skylar, Will, and his friends gather at a bar, where Skylar enjoys their company and shares jokes that elicit laughter from everyone. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald discusses Will's progress with Sean. Sean reveals that Will is gradually opening up, but he still needs more time to feel completely comfortable discussing his life and the challenges he faces with trust. Professor Gerald discloses that he has been arranging job interviews for Will at renowned mathematics institutes due to his unwavering belief in Will's talent. Sean argues that they should support Will in pursuing his own desires instead of making decisions on his behalf. However, Professor Gerald remains steadfast in his commitment to ensuring that Will's exceptional talent doesn't go to waste. Contrary to their plans, Will has no desire to pursue such a job. Instead, he sends his friend Chucky to attend the interview on his behalf. One evening, during a heartfelt conversation about their lives, Skylar proposes the idea of moving to California together. Overwhelmed by this suggestion, Will confesses that he cannot join her in such a move. Skylar wonders why he fears commitment and why he always hides the truth, mentioning his previous lie about having 12 brothers. Being called a liar deeply upsets Will, and he finally reveals the truth about his troubled past. He explains that he grew up as an orphan, constantly moving between different foster families. He bravely shares the painful experiences of abuse he endured at the hands of one of his foster fathers. However, Will pushes her away, asserting that he doesn't need anyone's help. Skylar insists that her love for him is genuine and promises not to abandon him, but Will, in an attempt to protect himself, lies and claims that he doesn't love her back. He abruptly leaves, leaving Skylar alone and in tears. After persistent persuasion from Professor Gerald, Will reluctantly agrees to attend a job interview. He shows up for the interview but makes no effort to secure the position. In his subsequent therapy session with Sean asks Will who he trusts the most in life. Without hesitation, Will names his friend Chucky. Sean understands that while Chucky would go to great lengths for Will's sake, he might not fully comprehend the depth of Will's emotions. Sean then poses the question of how Will plans to sustain himself financially. Will tells Sean that he will work as a construction worker in Boston for the rest of his life. Sean confronts Will for being afraid to leave his comfort zone and how it will prevent him from living a fulfilling life. Sean doesn't force Will to take the job that Professor Gerald has planned for him, but he asks Will what he truly wants to do in life. Will replies that he wants to be a shepherd. Sean realizes that Will is not being serious and asks him to leave his office as he doesn't want to waste his time if Will isn't being honest. Will becomes angry and starts shouting at Sean. Sean persists in asking Will what he wants to do in life, but Will remains silent and doesn't answer. Sean eventually tells him to leave. Before Skylar leaves for California, Will calls her to say goodbye. During a conversation with Chucky, Will reveals that he doesn't plan on getting a job and that he has broken up with Skylar. When asked about his plans for the future, Will answers that he intends to stay in Boston indefinitely, be neighbors with Chucky, and work with him in construction. Chucky, hearing this, becomes honest with Will. He tells him that it pains him to see his friend wasting his life when there is so much more he could achieve and be happy with. Chucky admits to having one wish, that every day when he comes to pick up Will, he hopes that Will won't be there. Chucky wishes that Will would leave his miserable life and actually start doing something meaningful. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald argues with Sean about his failure to persuade Will to get a job and utilize his intelligence to accomplish something significant in his life. Sean argues that they shouldn't rush into making life decisions for Will when he is unsure of what he wants. Sean suggests that they should support whatever Will wants to do and not force him into a job that he might end up hating. However, Professor Gerald disagrees with this approach. He warns Sean not to make Will believe that it's acceptable for him to waste his intelligence and live a life of failure. Their differing views lead to a heated argument, with Professor Gerald accusing Sean of being jealous of his success and achievements. At that moment, Will walks in and overhears their conversation. Professor Gerald leaves the room, allowing their therapy session to begin. Sean has a file containing pictures of Will's bruised body from the beatings he endured from his foster father. Will asks if Sean has seen anything like that before. Sean reveals that his father was an alcoholic who used to beat him and his mother when he was a child. Upon hearing Sean's story, Will remembers his own experiences with his foster father. Sean steps in front of Will and assures him that what happened to him was not his fault. Will acknowledges this, but Sean continues to repeat that it wasn't his fault. Will tearfully pushes Sean away, but Sean insists once again that the abuse he faced as a child was not his fault. Will finally gives in to his emotions and embraces Sean, crying while holding him tightly. He is finally ready to let go of his past and move forward in his life. Will informs Sean that he is going to accept one of the jobs that Professor Gerald arranged for him. With this decision, their final therapy session concludes. Will asks if he can stay in touch with Sean, and Sean reassures him that he will always be there for him and advises him to follow his heart. Will hugs Sean before bidding a final farewell. As a birthday gift, Chucky, Billy, and Morgan give Will a car. The car may not be brand new, but Will appreciates it because it comes from his best friends. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald apologizes to Sean for his earlier remarks. The two friends reconcile, and Sean informs Gerald that he is going on a world tour. While Sean is packing his belongings, Will drives up to his house and watches him prepare for his trip. Will walks up to the front door, places a letter in Sean's mailbox, and then drives away. Meanwhile, Chucky goes to pick up Will at his house but receives no response when he knocks on the door. He peeks through the window and realizes that Will isn't home. Chucky smiles, realizing that Will has finally made a decision about what he wants to do with his life. Sean also finds the letter left by Will. In the letter, Will explains that he has decided not to take the job and instead plans to go to California to be with Skylar. Sean smiles and returns to his house. In the end, we see Will on his way to reunite with Skylar. Hope you enjoyed this video. For more movie explanations and analysis, make sure to subscribe and check our other videos.